At 9:17 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the last formations of the second-wave attack aircraft fade into the southern horizon. The engines were still echoing across the deck when his gloved hands tightened around the railing. He had spent nearly a year designing every piece of this plan, every approach vector, every fuel calculation, every assumption. He had memorized the layout of Pearl Harbor so thoroughly he could sketch it with his eyes closed. He knew the number of American destroyers tied up at the piers, the positions of anti-aircraft batteries, the flight line arrangements of Army aircraft. His life's work was in motion, screaming southward on wings of steel. And yet, even as he watched them disappear, he had no idea that the most important numbers of the entire war, the ones that would decide everything, were catastrophically, fatally wrong. Tokyo thought the American Navy in late 1943 would have around 13,000 officers and barely 300,000 enlisted men. In reality, by that date, the Americans had over 2 million sailors, more than 219,000 officers, and nearly as many officer candidates. Japan's most critical intelligence estimate was off not by double or triple, but by more than 7 to 1. It was not a small oversight. It wasn't a misprint on a report or a misheard figure during a briefing. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy they were provoking, a miscalculation so massive that the war's outcome was sealed before the first torpedo hit Battleship Row. The first man who sensed something was wrong wasn't even a field officer or a battle planner. He was a young intelligence operative named Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa, a failed aviator whose flying career had ended because of a stomach ailment. Forced into intelligence work, his sharp memory and analytical mind turned him into a quiet asset. 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Tokyo sent him to Honolulu under diplomatic cover, posing as Tadashi Morimura. His job was simple: watch the Americans. He boarded tourist boats that meandered into Pearl Harbor, mentally noting ship positions. He chartered small planes to get airborne views of American installations. He memorized patrol routes, counted aircraft, watched how long it took ships to leave harbor, walked the beaches pretending to be a curious foreign traveler. Every single report he sent back was accurate. The problem wasn't Yoshikawa's eyes, it was Tokyo's assumptions. Japanese officers took his numbers, this many ships, this many air groups, and calculated how many crew members those ships would require based on Japanese manning standards. They assumed America operated like Japan: lean crews, maximum efficiency, minimal redundancy. What they didn't understand was that America had an entirely different philosophy, driven by industrial muscle and a massive population pool. Where a Japanese carrier might sail with 1,500 men, an American one carried over 2,200. Where Japan trained specialists slowly and carefully, America trained entire classes of recruits by the tens of thousands. Tokyo had intelligence, but they didn't have understanding. Inside Japan's naval culture, intelligence was considered a secondary function, less glamorous than command, less honorable than combat. Ambitious officers avoided it because it offered little prestige. Reports that contradicted existing assumptions were quietly minimized, replaced by confident predictions from operations divisions that preferred aggressive planning over cautious analysis. This culture created a blindness that no amount of data could overcome. Intelligence was collected but not comprehended. Assumptions were retained even when the evidence contradicted them. And because those assumptions aligned with how the Japanese Navy viewed itself, elite, efficient, methodical, those assumptions hardened into dogma. One of the planners relying on these flawed numbers was Captain Toshikazu Omi, a thoughtful officer in long-range operations. He studied American naval doctrine, construction schedules, and shipbuilding reports. He calculated replacement rates, training pipelines, support capacities, and logistics capabilities. But all of his calculations were based on personnel assumptions that were entirely false. His models showed that the United States could sustain perhaps 40 major combatants in the Pacific. With that estimate in hand, Japan's entire strategic vision, seize territory quickly, build a defensive perimeter, and force America into negotiation, seemed plausible. No one imagined that America might not only replace any losses but overwhelm every theater simultaneously with more ships and men than any navy in history had ever fielded. The heart of the problem was mirror imaging. Japan assumed America would fight like Japan. They assumed the Americans prized elite crews, slow and careful training, and long-term personnel development. They assumed mobilization would be constrained by tradition, cohesion, and quality control. The Imperial Japanese Navy expanded from 120,000 to roughly 300,000 men during the entire war, and even that felt enormous to them. They simply could not imagine a nation enlarging its navy by more than 2 million personnel in 36 months. But America didn't mobilize like Japan. It mobilized like America. In June 1941, the U.S. Navy had about 284,000 personnel. 18 months later, it had over 1.6 million. By the end of 1943, it was nearing 2.4 million. Where Japan saw limitations, America saw production lines. Where Japan spent years developing specialists, America built vast training facilities capable of turning civilians into competent sailors in 8 weeks. Japan's analysts looked at the American population, 131 million people, and didn't understand what it meant. They didn't understand the speed at which a nation with that many people, that much industry, and that much organizational capacity could mobilize. The first cracks in the illusion appeared at Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance spotted 2 American carriers and estimated perhaps 4,000 sailors operating them. But radio intercepts hinted at a far larger force with extensive logistics, multiple commanders, and support vessels that implied double the personnel. This was dismissed as inefficiency or inexperience. The pattern repeated at Midway, where Yorktown, thought crippled, miraculously came back to life within hours. Japanese officers could not understand how a supposedly similar ship could have so many spare hands for damage control and maintenance. Only later did they learn that Yorktown carried more than 2,200 crew, half again more than their assumptions. Then Guadalcanal shattered everything. Japan had expected a limited American landing force, maybe 10,000 men. Instead, over 16,000 U.S. Marines and sailors poured into the Solomon Islands, supported by a massive naval force and an endless stream of supply convoys crewed by merchant sailors who had been trained in months. Japan's analysts quietly whispered to one another that something was wrong, but no one wanted to challenge the doctrine. The Americans were supposed to be nearing their breaking point, not launching simultaneous offensives while keeping the Atlantic fully manned. By 1943, even Admiral Yamamoto began demanding answers. From his experience in America, he knew the country's industrial potential and cultural character. His message to Tokyo was blunt. The numbers in the field did not match the numbers on paper. Something was deeply wrong. In response, analysts were ordered to recalculate American strength using hard data alone: ship sightings, radio intercepts, captured documents, and interrogation reports. When the numbers were added up, the totals exceeded 850,000 operational personnel, and kept rising. Applying actual American manning standards pushed the number above 1.2 million. And this did not include recruits still in training. Japanese analysts were shaken, but institutional inertia kept them cautious. Then, in mid-1943, a captured American sailor shattered the last illusions. He explained that at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center alone, 20,000 recruits were processed every month, 240,000 per year. And there were multiple such facilities. Japanese interrogators refused to believe him. It sounded impossible. But when a German U-boat commander independently reported that American destroyer escorts carried nearly double the crew of comparable Japanese ships, the pattern could no longer be denied. Finally, Tokyo convened a special working group in the fall of 1943. For 6 weeks, they analyzed every scrap of intelligence without filtering it through cultural assumptions. Their report, submitted November 9th, estimated American naval personnel at nearly 1.8 million, possibly exceeding 2.4 million the following year. They were still underestimating, but they were close enough to see the truth. America could run full-scale operations in both oceans simultaneously. It could absorb losses Japan could never replace. It could fight a long war and grow stronger while doing it. Japan had entered a war it could never win. The implications were devastating. If commanders learned the truth, morale might collapse. If political leaders learned that war had been launched based on faulty intelligence, careers and institutions might fall apart. If the emperor understood how profoundly the numbers had been wrong, the blame could shake the entire military hierarchy. So the report was locked away, circulated among only a handful of officers. No public changes were announced. No strategic adjustments were made. Field commanders were kept in the dark. The war machine kept grinding forward on assumptions that were already dead. By December 1943, America had 2,374,094 naval personnel. Japan had predicted 296,000. The error was 7.8 to 1. What followed was inevitable. Throughout 1944, American forces surged across the Pacific in operations that would have been impossible under the old Japanese assumptions. Carrier groups multiplied faster than Japan could sink them. Destroyers appeared in numbers that defied belief. Amphibious invasions were supported by logistics fleets so large that Japanese observers struggled to count the ships. The overwhelming manpower behind these fleets ensured that every loss was replaced, every setback was temporary, and every victory pushed Japan closer to collapse. By the time the Philippine Sea battle erupted in mid-1944, the Japanese Navy was facing an enemy they had never actually understood, one whose size and strength had been invisible to Tokyo's planners until it was far too late. Their miscalculation had not merely shaped the war, it had determined its outcome long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor.